Dear students, dear viewers, hello and welcome to the lecture on financing of social entrepreneurship. My name is Barbara Scheck and I'm an assistant professor for social investment at the University of Hamburg. I'm also associated with the Social Entrepreneurship Academy in Munich, where I especially focus on teaching and education. First, let's have a look what we would like to show you in this module. In this lecture, I would like to give an introduction to the wide range of financing possibilities available to social entrepreneurs. Firstly, I'll start with a general overview of internal and external financing instruments, highlighting the specific attributes of the respective instruments, as well as the advantages and shortcomings. In the second part, I would like to draw your attention to the importance of finding the right type of financing, suiting the needs and capabilities of the social enterprise at the respective stage of the life cycle. I briefly also introduce the concept of social venture capital and will conclude with an outlook on future financing instruments with the examples of the social impact bond. Let's start with the general overview of financing instruments available to social entrepreneurs. The capital a social venture needs for its development, for example for buying certain resources, hiring employees, etc., can be distinguished by the source of the funds. These can either be provided by sources outside the company, that would be the so-called external financing, or they can be generated by the social venture itself by means of so-called internal financing. Several types of capital can be distinguished in every category. In the following, I will briefly elaborate on each of them and illustrate them with practical examples. Let's take a look at the possibilities for a social venture to generate income itself. In order to cover its costs, a social venture can generate internal financing from either public or from private sources. However, these means of funding are only possible for social ventures and only available to them if they operate in markets where public authorities or the beneficiaries themselves are both willing and able to pay for the services and the products that the social venture is offering. The first type, public funding, still constitutes the largest source of income for non-profit organizations in Germany. Authorities either directly pay for certain services, for example in the area of care for the elderly, or they subsidize the work of social ventures. That means they take over part of the incurring costs, as is happening, for example, in prevention campaigns. In some cases, it is possible to charge the beneficiaries themselves for the services they receive. For example, if parents pay for the kindergarten care for their children, or, for example, if a museum founds an association to support its activities by means of membership fees. A third way of obtaining private funds is the so-called sponsoring. That happens when companies can advertise their brand with a social venture in order for the support of certain activities. The advantage of internally generated private funds is that the social venture can dispose of them as it wishes. This is the reason why some social ventures also develop commercial activities that are not linked to their core mission. The World Wildlife Fund, for example, produces t-shirts and other merchandising articles that are being sold in order to cross-finance their environmental protection programs. In the next step, let's look at different means of external financing. If a social venture cannot or cannot yet generate income itself, it depends on external capital providers. Economically speaking, a donation is a financing instrument generating no financial return at all for the investor. Donations constitute the traditional means of support for social causes, so-called philanthropy, by individual donors, companies, or foundations. This type of funding is not linked to the provision of any service and does not have to be repaid. However, the costs associated with acquiring donations are very high and can constitute as much as 25% of the funds raised. In addition, it is always uncertain what amount of money can be raised and when the donations will be received. A second form of financing constitutes the so-called equity capital. This is money invested by founders themselves or their personal contacts, private investors that fund ventures directly, or they pool their money together with other investors in so-called venture philanthropy or social venture capital funds. In return for the money they provide, they receive a share in the company and hence become co-owners who fully participate in the success as well as the risks of the social venture. As a consequence, they are usually highly engaged. They will also want to have a say in important management decisions, and they require extensive reporting from the social venture. A third form of financing constitutes debt capital. This is typically money lent to the social venture for a special time at a certain interest rate. Repayment of the nominal capital plus interest usually takes place in regular intervals. However, some investors are also willing to provide so-called balloon payments, where only interest is paid on a regular basis and all of the nominal capital is paid back at the end of the term. The advantage of debt capital is that the social enterprise does not have to give up shares. However, this form of capital is only available if the venture generates enough cash flow in order to make interest and amortization payments. At the very beginning, a social entrepreneur does not dispose usually of this liquidity. In addition, newly founded social ventures often do not dispose of enough collateral to securitize the loans. Social ventures usually tap into several financing sources at the same time. If classic financing instruments are adapted to the specific situation of the social venture, this innovative form of financing is called hybrid capital, meaning that this form of capital combines elements from several types of financing. One example of a so-called hybrid capital as a mix between donations and debt capital is a so-called forgivable loan. The money is paid out first as a loan, and if the social entrepreneurs achieve certain objectives, so-called milestones, the money is converted into a donation and does not have to be repaid. Other types of so-called hybrid capital are recoverable grants, revenue share agreements, or guarantees. Another innovative form of financing, social ventures, that can combine various financing instruments is the concept of so-called social venture capital. The concept has been introduced into the social entrepreneurship sector by investors and entrepreneurs who have or have been financed by venture capital, especially in the area of information technology. These investors provide equity or equity-like financing to social entrepreneurs. This money is not paid out in total at the very beginning, but dispersed in accordance to specific milestones the social venture has to achieve. However, besides the money, and maybe more important than the money itself, is the non-financial support they provide. They work closely together with the organizations they fund and provide business advisory or access to their networks. What also distinguishes these investors from traditional philanthropists is the fact that they invest in building the organizational capacity of the social enterprise, and they are not focused on funding the project itself. One example of such a social venture capital fund is the German Bond Venture Group. In the German Bond Venture Group, investors pool their money in funds that are being managed by the Bond Venture Management GmbH. The investment managers in the GmbH select appropriate investment opportunities in German-speaking countries, conduct a thorough due diligence process, and tailor the funding instruments to the specific need of the social entrepreneur. The financial return expectation of the investor is to get the nominal capital back. If surpluses are being generated, they are transferred to a charitable entity that can provide donations or loans below market rate interest rates. So the bond venture group is structured as a social business. That means it can generate profits, but these profits are not distributed to the investors, but reinvested in form of donations or loans via the charitable vehicle. Besides these rather classic financing instruments, certain special forms of funding are also available to social entrepreneurs. They can be divided into indirect and direct forms of support. One example of a direct form of financing constitutes the support of the social entrepreneur itself, as provided by the organization Ashoka to their so-called fellows by means of a living stipend. An example for an indirect form of support constitutes the provision of infrastructure, if a company, for example, provides office space to a social enterprise. Besides knowing the different financing instruments, it is important to adjust the financing instruments to the specific situation of the social venture. Depending on the possibility to generate income, the requirements of funding and the possibility of obtaining certain funding differs. When a social venture does not dispose of collateral to securitize loans, an income cannot yet be generated by charging fees to beneficiaries, donations, equity capital, and hybrid capital that do not require imminent payback are probably most appropriate. Once the venture has successfully entered the market and is able to generate revenues from public or from private funds, other forms of financing become possible. If a regular sum can be used to pay interest or dividends, debt capital, or mezzanine capital, a form of financing that in the accounts of the organization is positioned between equity and debt, could be possible. If no regular payments can be made, interest-free loans, balloon payments, or certain forms of repayable hybrid capital are probably the most appropriate funding mechanisms. But keep in mind there's always a trade-off between the attractiveness of certain financing forms to the social entrepreneur. Remember, donations don't have to be repaid at all. And the breadth of funding possibilities available to the social entrepreneur, as you see at the very bottom of the slide. On the last slide to conclude with, I would like to briefly introduce a rather new financing instrument, the so-called social impact bond. A social impact bond brings together different social enterprises that collaborate in order to tackle a certain social problem. The operations are being financed by a private investor. These investors, however, have the commitment of the government that they will be reimbursed once the project has been completed successfully. For the first time, this instrument has been piloted in the UK at the Peterborough prison. Different social ventures work together in order to reduce the reoffending rate of male prisoners by working with the detainees themselves during and after the imprisonment, but they also support the families or the communities in reintegrating them. If they are successful in reducing the reoffending rate, the government assumes the costs of the program, in this case £5 million, and pays back the private investors. So what's in it for the government? Well, reoffending occurs significant costs to society, courts, imprisonment, etc. Preventing these costs in the long run is much cheaper, so prevention pays off for the government. And what about the investors? Why do they do it? Well, the money they get from the government after the successful completion of the program comprises the actual costs, £5 million, plus a certain interest rate. This is attractive for private investors and for governments still cheaper than dealing with high reoffending rates. This instrument is one example of innovation in financing social enterprises and is now being implemented worldwide from Australia to the US. This was a brief introduction to the financing possibilities for social entrepreneurs. But remember, it's not all about the money itself, and there's no one-size-fits-all. It is more important to find the right financing instrument and the right investor for your social venture.